Welcome to Growing and Aging Sex Positive.
Or GASP.
Get ready to grow with us as we discuss all things sex and sexuality related. I'm Nina.
And I'm Cari.
Today, we'll be starting at the beginning. What does the word sex actually mean? Come along with us as we explore the many ways to think about this.
And folks, we want to hear from you. What's on your mind? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will share questions and replies in a future episode. Please write to us at gasppod@gmail.com. That's GASPPOD@gmail.com. First, we want to thank our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park OWL has classes for kids in 1st, 5th, and 8th grade in the Greater West Side of Chicagoland area. Classes start in September and January each year. For more information, please go to their website at www.opowl.org.
Now let's get into it. What is sex anyway? Hi, Cari.
Hey, Nina.
We're going to talk about the definition of sex. What does it mean? And you brought some definitions to share with us.
To say I brought them and will quote them is a strong statement, Nina. I guess
That's
for
great.
our listeners, we should clarify that for today, what we're really talking about, I know in English, sex means many things to many people. So we're really talking about sexual behavior. So maybe a slightly more expansive set of behaviors than just sexual intercourse, but really not talking about specifically gender or sexuality across the lifespan.
That's a great point. We use sexuality to refer to so many different things, which hopefully we'll talk about in a future episode.
For sure. There's lots of stuff there.
But great to start with the topic of sex and sexual behavior. And you've already raised an interesting question. Why would we not just define sex in terms of intercourse?
Is that a question for me, Nina?
That is a question, Cari.
In prep for this episode, I did a little quick Google search. So non-scientific, just a very fun what is sex? And I think I also pivoted to what is human sex because I got some interesting stuff about gender and animals and all kinds of things. And the definitions I really enjoyed. There's a pretty wide spectrum of definitions. On the most conservative side, there is your very heterosexual, gendered version of sexual intercourse, which is penis and vagina penetrative sex. Some of the definitions, much to my amusement, used words like thrusting,
Oh,
which is fun.
that's colorful.
It is a colorful word. How do you feel about that?
That sounds like a Wikipedia definition.
For sure. I think it was one of the AI-generated Google answers. And then there's on the other end of the spectrum a very expansive and inclusive definition that any behavior, so not just physical behaviors, but also emotional, verbal, and physical contact that is desired result is to sexually arouse you, which I think is a very expansive and maybe not helpful definition of sex. And certainly if you were talking to your kids about it, probably not very informational.
That's a really great place to start, Cari. Thank you. We have a whole range of definitions.
Yep.
And no judgment here when we say conservative or I forget the word you use, liberal or inclusive.
Conservative and inclusive, not speaking to political views, really just speaking to the least expansive or the most specific. I guess when conservative, I really mean the least inclusive of behaviors. Certainly not a statement about political affiliation or social liberalism.
So important to
Super
say
important
these
in the
days.
sexuality space, too, that there's no political agenda. It's just There's a wide range in the way that people discuss sexual behavior.
So there would be advantages and disadvantages to having a more restrictive definition versus a more expansive definition.
For sure.
So what would be some advantages of having a more expansive definition?
Yeah, so I guess I should pause and clarify that I find the penis penetrating vagina definition to be very restrictive. And I think that specifically, it does not include certainly anyone who is not heterosexual, so people who are in queer relationships or have queer sex. That pretty much excludes many of those behaviors. For me, it also doesn't include some of the behaviors that I certainly feel are part of sex, so foreplay and other non-penetrative activities. And then it also doesn't include solo sex. So for me, that would be masturbation, and that is an important part of human sexuality and sexual behavior for me.
Great point. So we want a definition of sex that includes sexual behavior on the part of many different combinations of humans, as well as solo sex. I'm definitely on board with that.
Yeah, me too. And then I have to say, on the other end of the spectrum, that very expansive, and I guess I'll use the word open-ended discussion of what sexual behavior is, certainly in an education space, could be confusing, right? It could really lead to a lack of boundaries or parameters about socially what is considered sexual behavior.
I really wonder about any behavior that is intended to provoke arousal in another person. First of all, that still involves more than one individual, so that leaves out masturbation. And second of all, there are so many behaviors that can lead to arousal that I don't know if I'd want to call those having sex or engaging in sexual behavior.
Yeah, so me too. So do you want to offer what comes to mind for you in that scenario?
So maybe making eye contact across a crowded room, right? It could be with a stranger or anyone.
Yeah, could be an extra smile on your trip to get coffee in the morning at the barista. Does that count as sexual behavior if there's a slight flirtation? I think many of us would say no, that doesn't fall into our category of a sexual behavior.
Oh, wait. I'm starting to wonder. I'm backtracking.
I love it.
Eric. Oh, no. Because I maybe am making a distinction between engaging in sexual behavior and having sex. So definitely not having sex with a barista.
For sure. I think even in the most restrictive definition, that would be or expansive description, that would be a pretty... I think for most people, that would be a huge leap across all cultures. And good. I hope.
So we're on the same page there.
I hope.
But as far as engaging in a sexual behavior, I could
You're on the fence?
That. Yes. Because that's something that maybe is suggestive of going down a road towards sex, towards having sex, whether or not you decide to go down that road. It's implying that or maybe provoking a question about what that would be like.
Yeah, I'm quietly chewing on that myself internally. I think I'm on the fence about that. Yeah, I don't know if I even would consider those sexual behaviors. They certainly could be, depending on a lot of factors. But probably in terms of educating people about sexual behavior, I probably wouldn't include this sort of potentially sexually arousing social interactions that are not, for me, would
They are pretty far down the path. You'd have to walk a lot farther to really get to the having sex place.
Yes.
So maybe it's more interesting to ask about what does that look like? What is the having sex part?
Yeah.
When do we go from maybe flirting, maybe engaging in related activities to having sex? So you mentioned foreplay, I think.
For sure.
Is foreplay part of having sex? I would tend to say yes.
I would tend to say yes. And I would tend to say that is potentially inclusive of many different orientations and genders, and maybe isn't a controversial statement. I think many people would consider foreplay to be part of their having sex.
There's a ramping up that is needed, right?
Yeah, and there certainly is also an interesting dialogue that about foreplay and whether or not that's always a physical behavior. I know sometimes we hear people talk about, when we're talking about the more expansive definition, conversations throughout the day with potentially your spouse or your partner, and non-sexual behaviors that people might say, oh, that's foreplay. Now, for me, I would be talking about physical contact when I'm talking about foreplay. That's how I define foreplay. I would want some
a wink
sort of,
and a smile would not be.
No. And while I certainly respect that there are emotional factors and emotional intimacy and other factors that might impact the sex you're having, I probably wouldn't bucket them as sexual behaviors. Not directly, anyways.
How about the laundry?
Yeah.
This is this trope that we hear about, where if your partner does the laundry, it can be a big turn on, or does the dishes or other household chores. This is part of what adulthood is that suddenly the laundry becomes pretty sexy.
Yeah, and certainly when you're talking about monogamously couples and committed relationships that are living together, those domestic things, you'll hear people talk about, I can't be in the mood if I have all these other things happening, which is certainly, I think, I still probably wouldn't categorize doing the laundry as a sexual behavior. If I did, my life would be way more fun. Maybe it is for the partner. I don't know many people who get that level of satisfaction from doing their laundry.
From the actual laundry doing.
No. And on the flip side, I think it could be potentially problematic in any committed relationship it could become very transactional, right? Like, I did the laundry, therefore I'm entitled. I think we would all agree.
Let's go. Let's get hot and heavy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
More on the wink and the nod category than farther down the path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's fun about all of this dialogue is that there are many social and non-physical aspects to sexuality, which certainly might contribute to your sexual behavior and choices, but most of us would not define as having sex or having sexual contact with someone. So I think it's an important distinction and dialogue.
So important. The organ that is most involved in sex is your brain.
I'm glad we were both going to say brain. I was waiting to see what you said. A little pause there.
Absolutely. Let's see. So there's some sort of place where we would want to say we've gone past the wink and the nod and the laundry doing, and now we're having foreplay. And you said that has something to do with now we're having physical contact, or there's some sort of, that's going to be a vague line, most likely, and maybe different for everyone.
Yeah, I think definitely different for everyone. Anecdotally, I think people have different lines for what they consider to be an actual sex act. I think we've talked offline before about the idea that there should be some sort of, not should be, that's very poor language.
Avoid the word should.
Yeah, not great in any education and certainly not sexuality talk. But that we consider that there's going to be some genital contact. You talked about making out. I think that one's sort of a gray area up for debate if people consider that a sex act. I probably wouldn't, but it certainly could be part of the lead up to foreplay, right? There's some romantic and hopefully pleasurable physical contact, but I don't think most people would say, I made out with that person, so I've, quote, had sex with them. I think that would be a pretty extreme statement.
It's on the road. It's on that road again.
Yeah.
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 And maybe if it could be foreplay that halts before the actual having of the sex.
Yeah. I think people could. Another sort of interesting just idea in talking about foreplay, which I guess when I think about foreplay, I think about specific sex acts that were part of my sex education, which maybe is not the most expansive definition, but I'm definitely thinking about like oral sex or any kind of like hands to genital contact, also any like hands to other erogenous zones, because I certainly don't think it has to be genital contact, right? You could have other caressing, touching that has the intention of leading to further sex.
Interesting. I certainly those could be part of foreplay. I agree with that. But oral sex
Might be the whole Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I guess we should define the term, but even mutual masturbation, that might be that whole sex act, right? That might be what's satisfying for both partners.
That can be fun.
And mutual masturbation would be more than one person pleasuring themselves, so touching their own genitals, but not necessarily having any physical contact with one another. And I would consider that to be sex. And that could be the whole, that might not be foreplay to further sex. That could just be what they were in the mood for.
So having sex needs some kind of genital contact and pleasure.
Yeah, we love that. Say more about that.
If it didn't involve pleasure on the part of all individuals involved, then could it even be sex? I just don't see how. To me, that's part of what it means to engage in sex.
Yeah, for me too. I think pleasure with a capital P is the sort of most important and radical idea that you can bring to sex education, is that I certainly want pleasure to be forefront for any sex. But I'll add a personal caveat to that I think that doesn't necessarily mean physical pleasure from the sex act. I can think of many scenarios where you could be having sex with someone that isn't specifically for your physical pleasure. For example, trying to conceive a child. And certainly there are other spaces where you might have sex for power or to deepen emotional connection or for many other motivations and intentions that might not be physical pleasure, which I think are just as valid as the physical pleasure part.
You could still be having of the sex.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. People are complicated, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
We, on the other hand, if the folks involved, so maybe we want to say that there's some kind of consent required.
Yeah. And certainly in that caveat, consent of all parties involved would be very important. I would not define or think that sex where one party is looking to have power over another one to be a pleasurable or consensual interaction. So that's a super important footnote to that conversation.
Yeah. Then you also said something else, which was interesting too. You didn't quite say it, but you went in that direction about orgasm.
Yeah.
Is orgasm a necessary part of having sex? Is it not sex if you don't have orgasm?
Yeah. So I danced around that because that's almost its own topic. Sometimes I feel like in our culture, we will make orgasm synonymous with pleasure, sexual pleasure, and that you can't really, there's an idea that you can't have pleasure if there wasn't that orgasm achieved. And I don't personally believe that. I think that you can have lots of pleasure and enjoy sexual behavior without an orgasm.
Yeah, that's wild. That's what all the foreplay is about, right?
Right?
There's lots of pleasure there.
And certainly when you look at, I think you've mentioned in other conversations the word satisfaction. So certainly when you look at overall satisfaction, maybe satisfaction for that sexual interaction is not an orgasm, right? Maybe it's giving the partner pleasure, right? Maybe it's enjoying all the foreplay in the journey and trying something new, right? There's so many paths to pleasure that might not be an orgasm.
That's really important. And I do like that concept of satisfaction as part of the definition for sure, because there's a sense of completion and would be important to the whole picture.
Yeah.
To the sense of completing the having of the sex.
Yeah.
So we've got, where are we? We're at genital contact. We are at maybe pleasure broadly understood in terms of where pleasure maybe encompasses choice, consent, and satisfaction.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a happily inclusive definition of sex.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. And with yourself or others.
Yeah.
What about We've got a definition of sex, an idea of what we mean when we're talking about sex. We want to, what it means for something to be sex is different from saying whether it's good sex or bad sex.
Oh, I love that. That's super important.
It's possible for an interaction or an event to be sex, but maybe not great sex. Yeah. So what would that look like? Where maybe I've made this choice, but I'm not really feeling it.
I certainly think, again, the disclaimer or maybe just the overarching tone is that obviously as sex educators, we're very pro-consent. So when we're talking about this, we're certainly not talking about non-consensual sexual contact. So I'm really speaking about consensual, but maybe not satisfying sexual contact. And I think for me that is part of human sexual behavior. I think you talked about the brain being the most important organ in sex and sexuality. And I think it's pretty normal to not have every sexual interaction be the best. And certainly when we're talking to young people, I feel like that dialogue is super important because we're heavy on the consent and heavy on the pleasure and satisfaction. But figuring out how to do that for yourself or with another person or other people, plural, is something that requires sometimes some effort, right?
Some practice.
Practice makes perfect.
And practice necessarily involves not getting it right all the time.
Yeah.
Or not.
And that's leads to another topic that I definitely think is important when talking about, I don't know if the definition of sex, but just talking about sexual behavior is that underscoring all of this, along with the consent and satisfaction, is communication. So certainly if you're having partnered sex, the communication, whether things are going in the direction you want them to or not, and what you define as sex that we've talked about, that's a little bit fluid and not necessarily every sex act or every physical contact is going to be defined as sex for all people on the planet. So that communication is super important when you're having sex with another person. And sometimes that's verbal communication and sometimes that's nonverbal communication.
It's one reason I really think it's important to stress masturbation for young people.
Yeah.
Learn what feels good to you before you get into all the complications of engaging with another individual.
Yep.
Communication is hard.
So hard. Communication is so hard outside of sex, and then you add big feelings and bodies, and it is very challenging, I think, for people of all developmental stages, and particularly young people who are trying to figure out relationships and sex and what that means and what they want. So I'm very pro self-exploration. I also think in our society, I know you and I, Nina and I, do a lot of discussing what different body parts are called, what they look like, or the spectrum of what they might look like. But certainly knowing your body on a physical level, I think is something that's very important for young people and all people. And I think masturbation is one way to get comfortable with your physical parts.
There's no pressure.
There's no pressure, and you don't have to have any level of communication with another party.
So what would you say to, say, a 7th grader asks you, Cari, what is sex? What does this mean? Or younger.
Yeah.
Maybe we should start younger.
Younger. Certainly in my own household, I had really practical conversations about actual sexual contact by the time that question was coming up in my household, because that was important for the kiddo that I was working with. So I guess the header is that sex can be different for different people, and then actually defining genital contact and different sex acts, I think, is important in a developmentally appropriate way. Certainly a 7th grader is ready to hear about oral sex, hand to genital contact, penis and vagina, or penis and anus, any other behaviors. I think it's important to say those things to kids, because I do not like a diffuse kind of broad definition, because it can be a bit confusing for kids. and to build on that as you've had that first foundational conversation, because you certainly don't want a child leaving a conversation thinking a hug is sex, right? That can be a little bit difficult when you're having like this very soft and fluid definition of sex. You do want some guardrails, particularly for young kiddos.
That's a really important point. If we tell, say, a first grader, sex is a special kind of hug.
Yeah.
That could really...
There's some harm that could potentially be created there. Not potentially. I'll just go on record and say that that could be some really harmful messaging. It's too confusing, right?
Exactly. That's the harm. We want to be clear about what the harm is. The kid then goes away and thinks every time, is this hug a special kind of hug? Have I just had sex?
Yeah.
And that could really be damaging.
Yeah. And another probably, I don't want to say anxiety, but another reason that an adult or a parent might be coming to this podcast or this conversation is particularly with kids under first grade or up to first grade. Often the dialogue about sex is coming up because they're interested in where babies come from, right? Mm-hmm. So you might back yourself into that conversation when a kid is saying, where do babies come from, or where did I come from? And so I do think it's always okay to start with the simplest definition and see what, especially if you're a parent, what your own child is ready for. And also you can say, I'm going to go, I don't know how to answer that. I'm going to go research that. I think is a far better approach to add knowledge on knowledge versus saying something vague and confusing the kiddo. Because you definitely don't want a child leaving a conversation with your example of sex makes babies and a special hug is sex, right? Because that can be very frightening and too broad of a...
I might accidentally make a baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have anything you would add about talking to kiddos or defining sex for youth?
I really like your broader point about listening to what the kid is asking and what they might be ready for. I think that some seventh graders are ready to hear about the specifics.
Yeah.
And probably some seventh graders are not.
Yeah.
So keeping it simple, giving space for them to ask more follow-up questions.
For sure. And I also think there's a nuance or a space between, I guess I'll say from like a public health or a health perspective, you certainly want kids that are in puberty to have information about their body and other people's bodies just from like a safety and health standpoint, because you want them to be able to talk to you if there's anything going on with their body. But I love that you acknowledge the developmental spectrum and range is pretty wide. And so you want them to have information about their bodies and about sex from a safety perspective, but also being super respectful of what the context of them asking you is. So I have a funny anecdote about that, about in our community, many kiddos that I see socially through friends know that I'm a sex educator and know that I'm a safe person to ask questions to. And I quite often get questions from middle schoolers asking for tangible definitions of queer. And when I say queer, I do mean anybody of any orientation that's outside of just man, woman having sex. I get a lot of questions. How do lesbians have sex? How do two men have sex? And so I definitely think in those contexts, it's super helpful for the kid to get the actual body parts and sex acts, because what I find is that they're not really looking for the emotional context. They're not getting the full picture of how these bodies go together, and that can be really frustrating and confusing. And I've even had two kiddos say, I tried to ask at school and the teacher wouldn't tell me. And another one said, they just said however the women want.
So it's really a how question.
Yeah.
It is straightforward.
Yeah.
How does this work?
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating is right behind that, there's this assumption of penis and vagina intercourse.
Yeah. That hetero, I should define heteronormative, meaning considering that a very binary gendered man with a penis, woman with a vulva or vagina. And just for clarity, that is not my definition of gender or sex, but in the, quote, straight community. It's that idea, compulsory heteronormativity or heteronormativity, meaning that's the default human state, but that thread is so profound through our society that often kids and young people and also adults, when they start questioning what happens outside of just a penis and a vagina having penetrative sex, they're not finding any information. I consider it a win that they're asking because it means that they're not doing a Google search, which is my nightmare. So I actually love that they're asking. This other reason why I feel a call to give them a tangible answer, because you don't want them down Reddit.
Far better to ask Cari.
Yeah. Far safer searches than some of what might come up if a child were to Google, what is lesbian sex?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Those beliefs or those pictures are very much the default, the social default. And our kids absorb them somehow.
Yeah.
Right? Unless we directly speak against them.
Yeah.
And repeatedly.
Yeah. I like that you just said our kids absorb them, because I think there's no parenting shame, right? It's not as if your household has done something to make your kid think that the world is straight. That is often a very silent social message that just permeates all media, many of our social institutions, right? It's just a messaging. So even if I think parents are having conversations at home, the world is certainly maybe changing, but skewed to some not super inclusive or queer-friendly messaging. I do think we're having more conversations and things are shifting, but I think it's a work in progress.
Right. Here we are.
Yeah. But just as simple as sitcoms, it can be really difficult to find sitcoms that are not specifically about sexuality having a queer couple on them, right? What does that look like to kids if all the couples are...
It certainly was one of the big questions I had when I was in 7th grade biology, where we had the anatomical diagram of a penis and the very different anatomical diagram, which is internal and front-facing rather than side-facing. Anyway, so the penis goes in the vagina, but what does it look like just before the penis goes in the vagina? All that's part of the story. How do we get from point A to point B was the huge question in my mind as a child.
And often left very vague. Just uncomfortable, awkward. Somehow you find yourself naked with another person and it just happens.
That was terrifying.
Very confusing to me. Maybe that's a personal issue, but I do remember feeling, how did we get there? What's the plan? And I definitely think that does a disservice in the context and conversation that we've had about pleasure, satisfaction, and consent, because there's no dialogue about what sexual behaviors and acts. I don't want to say most, but I think many people would say that's not the beginning of the sex act, right? Penetration is not the start of sex.
It starts well before that.
Yes.
Much earlier on the path.
Yes.
Very important.
Yeah. In my own sex education, not in biology class, but in a health class, they also had those graphs, and it was only penis and vagina. Those were the only genital combination that was discussed. I don't remember anything else, but talked about states of arousal. I think the 4 stages of arousal.
You had that in health class.
I did.
Nice.
I did. I have in years since. They were okay. That does answer another piece. I guess we should define that for people. I'm not looking at the stages right in front of me, but it is the idea that the sex starts with arousal, meaning blood flow to your genitals. For the person with the vulva, that they become wet, lubricated. Changes in the vagina and vulva happen to make space and room for the penis to enter the vagina, erection, and then leads to a literal graft climax of orgasm. And that's the end of the physiological act of sex.
And then a drop-off.
And a drop-off. Yeah. I don't recall any discussion of things like hormones, but there's just it's supposed to be physiological, meaning how you become aroused to then have penetrative penis and vagina sex. That's a part of the story, and it was helpful to hear. And I do think they discussed some behaviors in the stages of foreplay and touching and arousal. But I've since received feedback and learned that it's very non-inclusive for queer people, and that often non-heterosexual people with different combinations of genitals and body parts, that doesn't represent a sexual episode for them at all.
I'm not surprised, because just for that to be that linear is just not going to work for all kinds of people, I think.
Yeah. And certainly I think for many people, partnered sex is like peaks and valleys, right? You might ebb and flow between different sex acts for a variety of reasons, and all of them could be pleasurable, and they may or may not end in an orgasm or any kind of, quote, climax with a capital C. Mm-hmm. And that's valid sex, right? So.
Yes, as long as it's satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, so to wrap up, what have we talked about? We've talked about the definition of sex. It can be more inclusive or more restrictive, or favor some inclusivity, but it can also, we also want to put some limits on what it means to have sex, with maybe a broader understanding of what it means to engage in sexual behaviors.
Yeah.
Having sex includes must-haves for having sex are genital contact, consent, pleasure, and satisfaction.
I love that definition we came to. That's a very holistic definition.
It works for me.
Yeah, it works for me too.
Great.
With room to add more knowledge for anybody that's interested, kiddos and otherwise. It's always an ongoing dialogue.
Work in progress, as are we all.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Cari.
Thanks, Nina. This was great. Thanks for spending time with us today. Don't forget, we would like to hear from you. What did you think of today's episode? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will share some questions and replies in a future episode. Please write to us at gasppod@gmail.com. That's GASPPOD@gmail.com.
And thanks also to our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park OWL delivers comprehensive, inclusive sexuality education to youth and families in the greater west side of the Chicagoland area. For more information, check out their website at www.opowl.org.
Take care of yourself and others. Talk to you soon.